Coming up on Fresh Dev, we demystify wp-config.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Fresh Dev. I'm your host, Matt.
And I'm Scott.
Scott, I almost was just in my brain, I could always just hear, and I'm Dan. So,
I know.
It's been a while since we've done the Fresh Dev stuff, so you've probably seen our last episode where we talked about WordPress and localhost, developing on localhost, the great tips, tricks, and reasons why you should. So Fresh Dev comes to you as a show where we break down some of the basic WordPress development speed bumps, how-tos. You know, if you're just getting started developing on WordPress, this is the show for you. Go ahead and hit subscribe. We want to hit over 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. And oh, by the way, this episode is brought to you by our latest WordPress theme, which is Modern Real Estate. Check it out, responsive WordPress theme for real estate agents.
It's a great thing.
Pretty cool. So, Scott, today we're going to demystify the wp-config file and what it's all about. Give it to us short and sweet. What is a wp-config file?
All right. It is the basic configuration file. It honestly is literally how WordPress communicates with the data. That's what it is, like the brain.
Like the brain. So without a working wp-config file or a properly configured wp-config file, WordPress probably isn't going to be working too well.
That's right, yeah.
So let's take a look at the required configuration settings. Got 4, 5, 6 fields here. Let's fire right through them. First one.
DB name?
DB name. Go ahead.
Yeah.
So what does the DB name actually do?
Just basically the database name. That's getting into the server stuff, but when you're creating a database, you have to specify a name. So you'll put that name in this field.
A lot of folks might see this when they are either setting up WordPress for the very first time. Sometimes their web host might have a one-click install. They might not even see this, but sometimes they have to punch in, what name do you want to use? What do you want to call your database? So that's probably where they most likely see it.
Yeah.
On to the next one.
DB user. This is the user that has access to the particular database, usually segmented across the entire MySQL server. Yep. So one user will have access to one database. That's usually a good way to do it.
I'm going to take a guess at DB password is probably the password that the username is going to use to connect to the database.
That is correct.
Obviously, harder the better. Store it in a safe place. Don't save it on your desktop. That kind of thing.
Exactly.
Sometimes again the host might provide you specific password restrictions. Must be 4 characters long with a mix of special characters. All that fun stuff.
And the last one will be DB host, and that is where your database is actually hosted. I think it's important to note that more often than not, this will be localhost, and that doesn't refer to what we talked about last week, where you're working on a local environment. What that means is the database server is on the same server as your website.
Gotcha. Sometimes a shared host might have a separate database server that is not where the website is residing, so they might see a different name in there. But without these 4 key connection fields,
you won't have a site.
Yeah, you will not be blogging on WordPress.
No,
you won't be creating pages or posts or anything like that. You need to have these correct, set up properly in wp-config, or else you won't see a site. Typically, hey, if the site's not loading and it's the first time you launch the site, you check these first. Make sure you can connect to the MySQL database.
Yeah, and I think one thing I want to mention here, Matt, is if you don't have a wp-config file, WordPress comes with a sample. And let's say you didn't create your wp-config file, WordPress will actually guide you through creating that. So it'll set up these 4 or 5 basic required fields. It doesn't go into any more depth, which we'll talk about in a little bit, some other configuration settings. But it does kind of walk you through in a GUI, graphical user interface, kind of a walkthrough tutorial. You're able to, use WordPress to create that. But again, as you said, if it's not set up right, you might see an error connection to the database, or another error generated by WordPress because your database name is incorrect.
That's great.
Something like that.
That's great stuff. There's some further configuration files. We're just going to touch upon just a few of them, not all of everything that's in wp-config, but we'll just hammer through some of these key important ones that we found. First one up being WP debug. What is that all about?
That's the one that we use here, I think, most often than not at the studio. And it just outputs, basically by default, WordPress doesn't output any errors on the screen. When you're developing, it's a good idea to enable this. That way you can see some errors or warnings that you may not have even know existed. But if you do enable it, you'll see those errors right on the screen if they are appearing.
And you and Dan actually looked at another plugin, right? A
debug bar, yes.
Debug bar.
I think we looked at two of those.
Yep.
We kind of compared those. And actually, yeah, it's important to note that one of those plugins, the one that was created by WordPress, if you turn WP debug on by setting this, you're able to see more debug information within the panel.
Nice. So that plugin doesn't actually enable this setting. You would still have to enable this.
Correct.
That's
it
awesome.
does enable various other options, but outside of wp-config though.
Very nice. So if you're a brand new WordPress developer just diving into it, trying to figure out why your site doesn't look the way it should look or it's not spitting out the data that it should be, it's a great place to start. DB char set, character set, whatever you want to call it. Tell us what that's all about.
You can basically specify a character set other than UTF-8, which is the default. Honestly, it's not necessarily needed all the time, but if you were in a country or a certain location that uses a specific character set, you may want to fool around with this and adjust it to the correct value.
Interesting. Security keys?
These are definitely good. Basically, WordPress can automatically generate these for you. So there's a URL that you can go to. It generates the keys for you. You can actually copy and paste the code that it generates directly into your config file. And what this does is basically salts the password. Have you ever heard of salting before?
Just on my steak, Scott.
That's right. It's similar to that, except we're not actually tasting anything. Yep. It's just adding something before the password, or adding something to the password. So you add salt to your steak. This is a form of doing that in programming. Nice. It just makes it more secure in this case. And you can actually invalidate existing cookies. And what that means, basically you could force all of your users to log in for whatever reason that might be.
So that could be done on the fly. All of a sudden, hey, there's something not right. All of a sudden I see these blog posts going up and I think I'm getting spammed. I might have 100, contributing authors to my website. I can just go in and blast away those cookies.
Yep, and then you'll want to change those numbers. You won't actually get rid of them, whatever values they are. But you can, when you do change these, it's going to make all of your users log in again.
Very nice, very nice.
So something to potentially get rid of all that spamming if that's occurring.
That's great. $table _ prefix. Hey, if you're just dipping your feet into the development pool, you'll start to learn different ways to say this stuff. You could say stable _ prefix. That's sometimes how I read it. But what is this all about? This is about the database prefix. If you're got a naming convention probably for your databases, or you want to organize your stuff a little bit better on your MySQL servers, is what you'd probably be using.
Yeah, this is actually that's how variables formed in PHP. So that's why you see the $.
Very good.
But basically, this option, you can set a certain prefix for your tables. It defaults to WP_, and that's usually fine for most installs. And especially now that they have multi-site, you really don't have to adjust this. But I think what it was implemented for was to be able to have more than one WordPress installation on a single database. So you could have a wp_ prefix for one WordPress install, and you could name it something completely different, like fresh web, whatever you'd like to, and then you could run both of those installations off of the same database. But I think it's better off to use multi-site in that instance.
Nice.
It's easier to set up.
Very nice. For the interest of time, we're going to fire away the lightning round of the last WP config settings here. WP site URL, useful if your core files are located inside of the directory. Anything else to add to that about the site URL?
Basically, if you moved your WordPress core files into another directory, like a subdirectory, you could specify.
We
it
want to
here.
tell them where it is.
Yeah.
Awesome. Autosave interval.
You're able to adjust the time between autosaves. It's defaulted to 60 seconds, but you can make it faster or slower depending on your needs.
Very useful. WP allow multi-site.
This gets back to that table prefix variable that we were talking about. I think this would be, again, the better way to do it, but this actually enables multi-site functionality, which allows you to run multiple blogs off of one WordPress installation.
WP memory limit.
This is one that I say you might want to use a little bit of caution when you're kind of playing around with. Basically, you can update or rather change the value that WordPress has for memory. So I think it might be, depends on your different hosts. Could be 32 megabytes, could be 64 megabytes of memory. You can change this value, usually if you're having any technical issues, but I think it's one to kind of stay away from for the most part.
Totally agree. I'm going to stay away from it. And last but not least, the empty trash days.
This one I found was kind of interesting. I'd never heard of it before, and I came across it, and I thought we should include it. Basically, you can specify the number of days before WordPress removes posts that are in the trash. I think it defaults to 30, but I may be mistaken on that. But if you do set it to 0, you can actually remove the confirmation, sending it to the trash bin. It'll actually delete it, right away, the post.
Very good, very good. So does that help demystify WP config file a little bit more? I know it does for me. Obviously playing a little bit of the devil's advocate there. I don't actually call the table prefix stable prefix for those in the audience, but we hope that helps a little bit. We're going to put some of the extra resources that we found in the show notes. Generate WP, which is kind of a cool little tool you can kind of configure.
Yeah, and you
WP.
can actually create a WP config file with more options than what WordPress gives you, by default.
Sounds pretty cool. So we hope that helps. Again, we want you to subscribe to the show. Let us know what you're struggling with as a web developer, web designer. Is it CSS stuff? Is it some jQuery stuff? Like, what is it that you're kind of bumping into when you're putting your WordPress site together? Let us know. slocumstudio.com/subscribe, slocumstudio.com/blog, and go ahead and hit subscribe on YouTube. We want to hit over 1,000 subscribers. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.